That's what Moses would tell his grandchildren decades later, when his hands were too gnarled to hold a plow, but still steady enough to carve stories into the air. The night of August 14th, 1836, chose 7 souls at Hollow Creek Plantation in Gilmer County, Georgia, and whispered a single word into their bleeding hearts: run. The thunder started at sundown, rolling across the Blue Ridge foothills like God clearing his throat. Master Edmund Calhoun was in town, 3 hours south in Dahlonega, drinking himself stupid on corn whiskey and bragging about his cotton yields. The overseer, a rail-thin man named Pritchard, with eyes like dirty ice, had taken ill with fever and was sweating through his sheets in the big house, and Mistress Calhoun, God rest her rotten soul, had retired early with her laudanum and her Bible, both of which she clutched with equal desperation. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. The quarters were silent except for the rain beginning to tap against the pine boards. Moses was 26, broad across the shoulders, scarred across the back. He'd been at Hollow Creek since he was 8, sold down from Virginia after his mother tried to poison the master's hounds. He remembered her face only in fragments now, the curve of her jaw, the way she hummed without opening her lips. He remembered her last words clearly, though, whispered as they dragged her to the wagon. When the door opens, you walk through it. Tonight, the door was open. He moved through the quarters like smoke, touching shoulders, pressing palms over mouths before the questions could form. Samuel, 42, one eye gone white from a whipping. Big Ruth, 38, hands like hammers from 15 years in the fields. Elijah, 19, fast as a spooked deer. Tobias and Jacob, brothers, 16 and 14, still boys but with men's rage already brewing. And Esther, 17, pregnant with the overseer's baby, whether she wanted it or not. And then there was little James, 6 years old, born on the plantation, orphaned at 4 when his mother died of childbed fever and his father hanged himself from the barn rafters the same week. The boy was small, quiet, and haunted, the kind of haunted that made even the other slaves nervous. He saw things, heard things, spoke to people who weren't there. When Moses crouched beside the boy's pallet, little James was already awake, already dressed in the only shirt he owned. "We go into the promised land," the boy whispered. Moses swallowed hard. "We gonna try. The woman with the feathers told me we would." Moses didn't ask which woman. He'd learned not to. They gathered what they could. A sack of cornmeal, a skinning knife, a canteen, 3 raw potatoes. Big Ruth wrapped her feet in strips of burlap. Samuel tucked a sharpened stake into his belt. Elijah said a silent prayer to a God he wasn't sure was listening. Tobias held Jacob's hand so tight the knuckles went white. And Esther stood in the doorway of the quarters with one hand on her belly and the other holding a rusted hoe, staring back at the big house with an expression that could have curdled milk. "I hope he dies slow," she said softly. Moses put a hand on her shoulder. "Let's make sure we live fast." The rain was falling steady now, washing their scent away, turning the red Georgia clay into rivers of blood-colored mud. They moved in single file, Moses in front, Samuel bringing up the rear, little James tucked between Big Ruth and Elijah, where he'd be safest. The dogs were locked up for the night, thank God. Pritchard had been too sick to let them loose. But come morning, when the bell rang and no one answered, those hounds would sing. They had maybe 6 hours. The pine forest swallowed them whole. Georgia in August was a living thing, cicadas screaming, owls asking questions, foxes slipping through shadows like rumors. The air smelled of wet bark and rotting leaves and something wilder, something older. They pushed north toward the Tennessee line, toward the stories Moses had heard whispered around cookfires, stories of black towns, of free settlements, of land where a man could stand upright without waiting for the lash. 2 hours in, Tobias stumbled, caught himself on Jacob's shoulder. "I'm all right," he whispered, though his feet were bleeding through the burlap. "We all bleedin'," Big Ruth said. "Ain't stoppin' for it." Another hour. The rain stopped. The moon broke through the clouds, fat and low and white as a slave catcher's eye. Moses felt it watching them, felt the weight of it on his neck. He'd heard the stories about the patrols, about the men who hunted runaways for sport and profit, about the things they did when they caught you. He'd seen the bodies brought back, seen what was left of them after the examples were made. But he'd also heard other stories, stories about the Cherokee, the land they were walking through. This wasn't white man's land, not originally. This was stolen earth, taken in the lotteries of 1832, carved up and handed out like birthday cake after the Indian Removal Act squeezed the Cherokee Nation west toward Oklahoma. Most of them had gone. 16,000 souls marched at gunpoint along what would later be called the Trail of Tears, but not all of them went. Some stayed, some hid. Some turned feral with grief and rage, haunting the hills like revenants, striking at surveyors and settlers and anyone fool enough to think this land had forgotten its first children. Moses had heard the stories from an old Cherokee woman who used to come to the plantation to sell herbs. She'd looked at him once, really looked, not through him, not past him, but at him, and said something in her language he didn't understand. Then, in English, "The land knows blood, all blood. Yours and mine." He wondered if she was still alive. He wondered if the land was listening. At dawn, they stopped to rest near a creek, the water running fast and cold over black stones. Little James knelt at the edge and cupped his hands, drinking deep. When he looked up, his eyes were distant. "They're comin'," he said. Moses felt his stomach drop. "Who?" "The men on horses, the loud ones." Samuel grabbed Moses's arm. "We need to move, now." But it was too late. From the south, faint but unmistakable, came the sound every runaway slave feared more than death itself: the baying of hounds. The patrollers rode out at first light, 7 men strong, armed with rifles, revolvers, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. They were led by Captain Wade Doggett, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from hickory and left out in the sun too long. He'd been hunting runaways for 12 years, had a scar across his throat from a desperate man's knife, and a reputation that stretched from Atlanta to Chattanooga. He didn't bring slaves back alive unless the bounty was better that way. Beside him rode his brother Lyle, shorter, meaner, with a laugh like a rusty gate. Then there was Pickens, a tobacco-stained tracker who could follow a scent through hell. Harris and Boone, 2 farm hands who signed on for the violence more than the money. Sutton, a preacher's son who quoted scripture while loading his rifle. And finally, young Tom Farrow, 17, eager to prove himself a man by dragging black bodies through the mud. They found the trail within an hour. "Fresh," Pickens said, crouched low, fingers brushing the torn earth. 6, maybe 7, one small, child-sized. Wade Doggett spat. "Calhoun's offering $50 a head. 100 if we bring back the big one. Moses, I think his name is." "Man like that could start an uprising." Lyle grinned. "Then let's make sure he don't start nothing but a grave." The hounds pulled them north, noses down, voices rising in that terrible harmony that meant blood was near. The men rode easy, joking, passing a flask of whiskey between them. To them, this was sport. To them, the people they hunted weren't people at all, just property with legs, animals that needed corralling. They didn't notice the forest growing quieter. They didn't notice the crows gathering in the branches above, and they didn't notice, not yet, that they were being watched. From the ridge to the west, hidden among the laurel and the shadows, a group of men stood motionless. Their skin was copper and bronze, their hair long and black, their eyes hard as flint. They wore no uniforms, no feathers, no war paint, just simple hunting clothes, deer skin and homespun, stained with travel and earth. But each man carried a weapon, a rifle, a tomahawk. A knife honed to a whisper, and each man carried a memory. The leader, a man named Sali, though the whites had tried to make him forget that name, watched the slave patrollers pass below with an expression carved from stone. He was 34. He'd lost his wife on the trail, lost his daughter to fever, lost his son to a bullet from a Georgia militiaman who thought it was funny to shoot at Indian kids. He had nothing left to lose. Beside him, a younger warrior named Sequoia, not the sequoia, but named in honor, notched an arrow and waited. "They hunt the black ones," Sequoia whispered in Cherokee. Sali nodded. "The enemy of our enemy." Another man, older, grey-bearded, named Ama Edohi, spoke quietly. "If we do this, there is no going back. The whites will come for us." Sali's smile was cold and sharp. "The whites are already coming." They moved like ghosts through the trees, paralleling the patrollers, waiting for the right moment. The forest, stolen and scarred, seemed to hold its breath. And somewhere ahead, 7 runaways ran for their lives, unaware that the hunters had just become the hunted. Moses pushed them harder than muscle and bone should allow. The baying of the hounds grew louder, closer, a sound that turned bowels to water and made even the bravest man want to curl up and wait for the end. But Moses had seen what waiting brought. He'd seen men give up, seen them kneel in the dirt with their hands behind their heads, seen what the patrollers did to them anyway. Better to die running. The creek became a river, waist-deep and furious with rainfall. Moses plunged in first, the cold shocking the air from his lungs. He turned, reaching back for little James. The boy's eyes were wide, terrified, but he didn't cry. Moses had never heard him cry. "Hold on to me," Moses said. "Don't let go." Big Ruth came next, then Esther, her pregnant belly making the current fight her twice as hard. Elijah and the brothers followed, and finally Samuel, who kept looking back over his shoulder like he could hold off the devil with just his stare. The water tried to take Jacob, 14 years old and already half drowned by life. The current grabbed his legs and pulled, and for a horrible moment he went under, his hand slipping from Tobias's grip. Tobias screamed his brother's name and dove, and Samuel lunged forward, his one good eye useless in the churning foam, but his hand sure and strong. They broke the surface together, gasping, Jacob coughing up river water and terror. "Keep moving!" Moses shouted over the roar. "The water'll hide our scent." They stumbled onto the far bank, soaked and shaking, and pushed into a thicket of mountain laurel so dense it swallowed light. Moses counted heads. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Everyone still breathing, everyone still human, still free for at least another moment. Behind them, across the river, the hounds arrived. 3 massive bloodhounds, red-eyed and slavering, crashed through the underbrush and hit the water's edge. They circled, whining, confused by the current. The scent washed away downstream. The patrollers emerged seconds later, horses snorting, men cursing. Moses held little James close, one hand over the boy's mouth, though the child hadn't made a sound. They all pressed deeper into the laurel, thorns catching clothes and skin, lungs burning from held breath. Captain Wade Doggett sat high in his saddle, surveying the river with cold calculation. He was a hard man, made harder by a life spent believing some people were born to own and others born to be owned. He'd never questioned it, never had to. "They crossed here," Pickens said, dismounting, crouching at the bank. "Recent. Minutes, maybe." Can the dogs track through water?" Lyle asked, that mean grin still on his face. Pickens shook his head. "Current's too strong. Washed 'em clean." Wade considered this. The forest ahead was thick, dangerous territory. This far north, they were getting close to what used to be Cherokee land, might still be Cherokee land, depending on who you asked. The settlers in these parts told stories about surveyors going missing, about trappers found with their throats cut, about hunting parties that rode out and never rode back. But $50 a head was $50, and pride was worth more than caution. "We cross," Wade said. "Spread out on the other side. They're tired, they're slow, and they got a child with them. We'll have 'em by noon." Young Tom Farrow, eager and stupid, spurred his horse into the water first. The animal resisted, eyes rolling, but Tom kicked harder and the horse obeyed. The others followed, the hounds reluctant but obedient, pulled along by leather leashes. From the laurel thicket, Moses watched them come, watched them cross, watched them reach the far bank, water streaming from the horses' legs, men reloading rifles that had gotten damp. And that's when Moses saw them, the Cherokee. They appeared like they'd been carved from the forest itself. 8 men, maybe 10, materializing from behind trees and out of shadows so completely that Moses wondered if they'd been there all along, invisible until they chose not to be. They wore earth tones, greens and browns, nothing bright, nothing that would catch the eye. Most carried rifles. 2 had bows. 1 had a tomahawk that caught the early morning light and threw it back like a promise. The man in front, broad-shouldered with hair to his waist and a face that looked like it had been through wars and come out the other side still dangerous, raised 1 hand. Not in greeting, in signal. Moses felt his breath catch. Beside him, Samuel whispered, "Lord, have mercy." But mercy wasn't what happened next. The patrollers didn't see them until it was too late. Wade Doggett was the first to sense something wrong. A prickle at the back of his neck, a prey animal's instinct buried deep under years of being the predator. He turned in his saddle, scanning the tree line, and his eyes found Sali standing 30 yards away, rifle raised, perfectly still. For a moment neither man moved, then Sali fired. The shot cracked through the forest like thunder, and Pickens, the tracker, the one who'd followed the scent across rivers and through valleys, jerked backward off his horse, a red flower blooming in the center of his chest. He hit the ground hard, dead before his body stopped rolling. Chaos erupted. The Cherokee came from every direction at once, from behind trees, from above on the ridge, from the thick laurel that Moses and the others were hiding in. Arrows whistled through the air. Rifles barked, men screamed. Lyle Doggett got off 1 wild shot before an arrow took him through the throat. He made a wet, choking sound and slid from his saddle, hands clawing at the shaft, eyes wide with the shock of a man who never believed he could be killed. Harris tried to run. His horse reared, dumping him into the mud, and he scrambled to his feet, running blind. He made it 15 feet before a tomahawk buried itself between his shoulder blades. He fell forward, twitched once and went still. Boone and Sutton tried to make a stand, back to back, firing into the trees. Boone hit 1 Cherokee warrior, a young man who went down with a cry, clutching his side. But Sequoia was already on him, moving like water, and his knife found Boone's kidney with surgical precision. Sutton turned to help and took an arrow through the eye. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Wade Doggett was fighting for his life. He'd killed 3 men in his lifetime, all of them black, all of them unarmed, all of them begging, but he'd never faced a real warrior. Tsali came at him with no hesitation, no fear, just cold efficiency. Wade fired his revolver, missed, fired again, grazed Tsali's shoulder. The Cherokee didn't even flinch. Tsali's tomahawk took Wade's gun hand off at the wrist. Wade screamed, a sound so raw and animal that even the horses tried to bolt. He fell from his saddle, clutching the stump, blood pumping between his fingers. Tsali stood over him, breathing hard, the tomahawk dripping. "Please," Wade gasped. "Please, I got money, I got—" "You have nothing," Tsali said in English, his accent thick but clear. "You had land, you had people, you had peace, you took it all." He raised the tomahawk. "This is for my daughter." The blade fell. Young Tom Farrow ran. He was 17, barely shaving, and he'd signed up for this because his father said it would make him a man. He'd laughed with the others, drunk the whiskey, imagined himself a hero bringing back dangerous slaves. But there was nothing heroic about this. This was slaughter. He crashed through the forest branches, whipping his face, lungs screaming. Behind him, he could hear them coming. Footsteps that barely made a sound, but he felt them anyway, felt them closing in like wolves on a wounded deer. He burst into a clearing and stopped, spinning, trying to find a direction that didn't have death in it. Moses stepped out of the trees. Tom's hand went to his gun, but Moses was faster. He'd picked up a fallen branch, thick as a man's arm, and he swung it like he was trying to split the world in half. It caught Tom across the face, sent him sprawling, blood exploding from his nose. Tom tried to crawl away, but Big Ruth was there, and Elijah, and Samuel. They surrounded him, 7 freed slaves standing over one patroller, and for the first time in his life, Tom Farrow understood what it meant to be prey. "Please," he whimpered, exactly like Wade had. "Please. I didn't want to. They made me. I'm sorry. Please." Moses looked down at him, looked at this boy who'd come to drag him back to hell. This boy who would have killed little James without a second thought because the law said he could. Behind Moses, Tsali and his warriors emerged from the forest, blood on their hands and vengeance in their eyes. "He is yours," Tsali said to Moses. "Do what you will." Moses stood there, branch in hand, staring at the crying boy in the dirt. Every scar on his back burned. Every memory of the whip, the chain, the auction block, the nights his mother had cried herself to sleep, all of it demanded payment. But little James was watching. Moses dropped the branch. "Strip him," Moses said. "Take his boots, his weapons, everything. Then let him run." Tom looked up, hope flickering in his terrified eyes. "Run back to your people," Moses continued, his voice hard as iron. "Tell them what happened here. Tell them what happens when you hunt men who got nothing left to lose." They stripped Tom naked, took everything, and sent him stumbling south through the forest, bleeding and broken and forever changed. The aftermath was silent, except for the wind. 7 patrollers lay dead in the clearing, arranged by the Cherokee in a perfect circle, their bodies stripped, their scalps taken. It was an old tradition, one that white men had taught indigenous peoples by offering bounties for Indian scalps, a lesson learned and returned with interest. Their patrol badges, tin stars that said Georgia Militia, were nailed into their foreheads. Tsali stood in the center of the circle, hands bloody, face unreadable. Around him, his warriors gathered the weapons, the ammunition, the supplies. One of them had been wounded. The young man Boone had shot, but the wound was clean through and through. He would live. Moses approached slowly, little James clinging to his hand. The other runaways hung back, uncertain, caught between gratitude and terror. "Why?" Moses asked. Tsali looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke in Cherokee, and Ama Edohi translated, his English slow but sure. "We did not do this for you," the old warrior said. "We did this for us. These men, all white men like them, they take and take and take. They took our land, they took our people, they took our children and marched them west to die." He paused. "You know what it is to be stolen. You know what it is to run. We are not the same, but our enemies are the same." Moses nodded slowly. "What happens now?" Tsali spoke again, and Ama Edohi translated, "Now you run north, fast. When they find these bodies, they will come with armies. We will be gone, deeper into the mountains where they cannot follow. You should be gone too, to Tennessee, to freedom. And if they catch us," Ama Edohi smiled, a grim thing, "then you make sure they pay for it." Tsali stepped forward and placed something in Moses's hand, a small pouch, leather tied with sinew. Inside were seeds, corn, beans, squash. "For when you find land to plant," Ama Edohi translated, "for when you are free." Moses felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd kept locked for so long he'd forgotten it was there. He nodded, unable to speak. The Cherokee melted back into the forest. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, like they'd never existed at all. Moses and the others stood in the clearing for a long moment, staring at the bodies, at the blood soaking into Georgia soil, at the evidence of a war that was never supposed to be theirs, but had become theirs anyway. "We should go," Samuel said quietly. Moses nodded. North, fast. They moved through the forest like ghosts, following the ridge lines, staying off the trails. Behind them, the crows descended on the clearing, their cries echoing through the hills, a sound that would haunt North Georgia for generations. Tom Farrow stumbled into Dahlonega 3 hours past noon, naked, bleeding, and half-mad with terror. He collapsed in front of the general store on Main Street, and within minutes a crowd had gathered. Miners, merchants, farmers, wives with their shopping baskets, all staring at the spectacle of a white boy reduced to something less than human. Sheriff Benjamin Wardlaw pushed through the crowd, a big man with a bigger gut and a star that he polished every morning like it was holy. He looked down at Tom with disgust and something else, fear maybe, or the beginning of it. "Get him some clothes," Wardlaw barked, "and water. Somebody get the doc." They wrapped Tom in a blanket and hauled him into the sheriff's office, a cramped building that smelled of tobacco and old sweat. Doc Mercer arrived, examined the boy, pronounced nothing broken that wouldn't heal, and left. Tom sat shivering by the stove, gulping water, unable to speak coherently for the first 10 minutes. When he finally did speak, the words came out in a torrent. "Dead," he gasped. "They're all dead. Wade, Lyle, Pickens, all of them. The Indians, they came out of nowhere, just appeared, and they had rifles and arrows, and, God, Sheriff, they scalped 'em, and—" "Slow down, boy," Wardlaw said, though his own pulse was hammering. "Start from the beginning. You were hunting runaways from Hollow Creek." Tom nodded frantically. 7 of 'em. We had the dogs, we had 'em cornered, we crossed the river, and then they were just there, Sheriff, like ghosts. Cherokee had to be Cherokee, and they killed everyone they— How many Cherokee? 8, maybe 10, I don't know. I ran. Did the slaves help them? Tom blinked. What? The runaways? Did they fight alongside the Indians? Tom's face twisted, trying to remember through the fog of terror. I don't know. Maybe. One of them, the big one, Moses. He stopped them from killing me, told them to let me go. Wardlaw leaned back, mind working. This was bad. This was worse than bad. 7 white men dead, killed by Indians, and possibly aided by escaped slaves. If word got out, there'd be panic. If word got north, there'd be federal involvement. And if the Cherokee were really still in these hills, organized and armed. Where's the site? North of Hollow Creek, past the river, maybe 5 miles into the hills. Wardlaw stood. You're staying here. Don't talk to anyone, you understand? Not a word. But Sheriff, not a word. Wardlaw gathered a posse within the hour. 12 men, all armed, all experienced. They rode north in grim silence, following Tom's shaky directions. The sun was setting by the time they reached the clearing, and what they found there would become legend, whispered about in taverns and parlors for the next 100 years. 7 bodies, scalped, stripped, arranged in a circle like some kind of pagan ritual. Their badges nailed into their skulls, the metal glinting in the dying light. The ground was churned with footprints, boots and moccasins, slave shoes and bare feet, all mixed together in the mud, like evidence of an alliance that wasn't supposed to exist. One of the posse members, a farmer named Gideon, vomited into the bushes. Another, a veteran of the Creek Wars, just stood staring. "I seen Injun work before," he said quietly. "This is personal. This is revenge." Wardlaw walked the perimeter, reading the scene like a book he didn't want to finish. The patrollers had been ambushed. That much was clear, taken by surprise by men who knew this terrain better than any white man ever would. But the question that gnawed at him was the alliance. Had the slaves and the Cherokee worked together? Or had the Cherokee simply taken advantage of the chaos? He knelt by Wade Doggett's body. The man's face was frozen in a rictus of agony and shock. His gun hand was gone, severed cleanly. There was a brutality to this that went beyond simple killing. This was a message. "Sheriff," one of the men called. "Over here." Wardlaw walked over. The man was pointing at a tree, and carved into the bark, fresh and deep, were words in English. "This land remembers." Underneath, In what Wardlaw assumed was Cherokee script were more symbols, angular, deliberate, furious. "What's it say?" Gideon asked. "I don't know," Wardlaw lied. But he had a feeling he knew exactly what it said, in any language. "We are still here." They loaded the bodies onto wagons and rode back to Daloiga in the dark. By morning, the news had spread like wildfire. By noon, the newspaper offices in Atlanta and Savannah were scrambling. By evening, Edmund Calhoun, master of Hollow Creek Plantation, drunk and furious, was standing in Wardlaw's office, demanding action. "7 of my slaves," Calhoun roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "7? That's $4,000, Sheriff. 4,000. And you're telling me they just walked off into the wilderness with help from savages?" "I'm telling you," Wardlaw said evenly, "that we have a bigger problem than your missing property. 7 white men are dead, Calhoun, killed by Cherokee who are supposed to be halfway to Oklahoma by now. If they're organizing, if they're working with runaways, then you hunt them down," Calhoun spat. "You get the militia, you get the army if you have to, and you burn those hills until there's nothing left but ash." Wardlaw stared at the planter, at this man who'd built his fortune on the backs of stolen people and now couldn't comprehend that those people might fight back. "It ain't that simple." "The hell it isn't! You think I'm the only one watching this? Every plantation from here to Savannah is watching, Ben. If word gets out that slaves can run north and get help, that Indians are killing patrollers, you'll have an uprising on your hands. Is that what you want?" No, Wardlaw thought. But he also didn't want to send more men into those hills to die. He'd read the reports from the removal, the ones that weren't published, the ones about Cherokee warriors who refused to leave, who'd gone to ground in the mountains and turned themselves into ghosts. Hunting them would be like hunting smoke. But Calhoun was right about one thing: the story couldn't get out. "I'll handle it," Wardlaw said. "How?" "I'll handle it," Wardlaw repeated, colder this time. Calhoun stared at him for a long moment, then turned and left, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Wardlaw sat alone in his office, staring at the wanted posters on his wall, drawings of black faces, names and prices, rewards for property returned. He thought about the bodies in the clearing, about the message carved into the tree, about the fact that somewhere out there, right now, 7 people who were supposed to be slaves were breathing free air. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, poured a glass, drank it in one swallow. Then he got up, walked outside, and gave orders to bury the story. The Atlanta Constitution ran a brief notice. 7 men from Gilmer County died in a hunting accident. The Savannah Republican didn't mention it at all. The official sheriff's report listed the cause of death as misadventure in rough terrain. Edmund Calhoun filed an insurance claim for his lost slaves and bought 7 new ones at auction in Charleston. Tom Farrow never spoke publicly about what happened. He moved west to Alabama, married, had children, and died at 43 from a stroke. His grandchildren would later say he had nightmares until the very end, dreams of men without faces, chasing him through endless forests. Sheriff Wardlaw served another 12 years before retiring. He never led another manhunt into the hills. When asked why, he'd just shake his head and pour another drink, but the story didn't die. It couldn't. Because stories like that, stories about people reclaiming their humanity, about the oppressed striking back, about land that remembers and demands payment for blood, those stories have roots too deep to pull up. They spread underground, whispered from slave quarter to slave quarter, carried north along the Underground Railroad, told around campfires and in parlors and in churches where God's justice was a thing to be hoped for, not just in heaven, but here, now, on this stolen earth. The story lived because Moses lived. For 3 days and nights, the 7 runaways moved north through terrain that seemed designed to kill them. The Appalachian foothills of North Georgia were beautiful and merciless, steep ridges that shredded already bleeding feet, laurel thickets so dense you had to crawl through on your belly, streams cold enough to stop your heart if you stayed in too long. But they were free, and freedom made you strong in ways slavery never could. Moses led them with a quiet certainty that surprised even him. He'd never been a leader before, had spent most of his life with his head down, his mouth shut, doing what he was told so the whip would find someone else. But out here, with no master's voice in his ear, something ancient and powerful had woken up inside him. Maybe it had always been there, just waiting. Big Ruth walked beside him most of the time, her presence steady as stone. She didn't talk much, but when she did, people listened. She'd been a field hand for 20 years, had watched 2 husbands sold away, had buried 3 children who died before they could walk. But she hadn't buried herself, hadn't let the plantation kill the part of her that could still feel rage, still feel hope. "How much further you think?" she asked on the 3rd morning, as they paused to drink from a spring. Moses looked north, toward mountains that seemed to go on forever. "Tennessee lines, maybe 2 days, if we don't run into trouble. And if we do, then we run faster." Esther sat with her back against a tree, one hand on her swollen belly, the other holding a strip of dried meat they'd found in one of the patrollers' saddlebags. She was 17 and pregnant with a white man's child, and she'd had every reason to give up a dozen times over, but she hadn't. She was still here, still moving, still fighting. "Baby's kicking," she said quietly. Big Ruth knelt beside her. "That's good. Means it's strong. Strong enough to be born free. Strong enough to try." Samuel kept watch on a rocky outcrop above them, his one good eye scanning the forest for any sign of pursuit. He was the oldest among them, 42, and he'd seen things that would have broken a younger man. He'd been sold 5 times, whipped more times than he could count, and once, just once, he'd tried to escape. They'd caught him in 6 hours. What they did to him after that had cost him his eye and nearly cost him his life. But here he was, still breathing, still free. Elijah, Tobias, and Jacob sat together in a tight cluster, the brothers leaning on each other the way they always did. Tobias was 16, Jacob 14, and Elijah, at 19, had taken on the role of older brother to them both. They'd grown up together on Hollow Creek, had been children together before the plantation taught them they weren't allowed to be children, and little James sat apart from the others, as he usually did, talking softly to someone no one else could see. Moses had stopped being unnerved by it. The boy spoke to spirits, or ghosts, or ancestors, or maybe just the wind. Whatever it was, it had kept him alive this long. "We ready to move?" Moses asked. Nods all around. They gathered their meager supplies, a stolen canteen, a knife, the sack of cornmeal that was almost empty, the pouch of seeds the Cherokee had given them, and started walking again, north. Always north. They crossed into Tennessee on the 5th day. There was no marker, no sign, no indication except for the way the land felt somehow different, like the air was a fraction lighter, like the trees stood a fraction straighter. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was just hope. Either way, Moses felt it. "We're close," he said. "Settlement called Fayetteville, maybe 30 miles northeast. I heard there's free black folks there, people who'll help." "You heard," Samuel said, "or you know." "I heard from someone who knew someone who made it," Moses admitted. "But it's all we got." They walked in silence for a while, exhaustion settling into their bones like fog. None of them had slept more than a few hours at a time since leaving Hollow Creek. None of them had eaten a real meal. They were running on nothing but will, and then little James stopped walking. "Someone's coming," he said. Everyone froze. Moses felt his heart kick into overdrive. "Where?" The boy pointed east. 3 men on horses, not patrollers, different. Moses didn't question it. He never questioned little James. "Hide, now!" They scattered into the brush, pressing themselves flat, weapons ready. The knife, a sharpened stick, a rock. If this was the end, they'd make it cost. 3 riders emerged from the trees minutes later. They were black men. Moses felt the breath leave his lungs. The riders were dressed in simple working clothes, wool shirts, canvas pants, wide-brimmed hats. They carried no chains, no whips, no weapons that Moses could see. They sat on their horses like they owned them, like they owned themselves, and the sight of it was so alien, so impossible, that for a moment Moses forgot how to move. The lead rider was older, maybe 50, with grey threading through his beard and eyes that had seen too much but hadn't gone hard from it. He pulled his horse to a stop and looked directly at the brush where Moses was hiding. "You can come out," the man said, his voice steady and kind. "Ain't nobody here gonna hurt you." Moses stood slowly, the knife still in his hand. The others emerged one by one, wary as hunted animals. The rider looked them over, 7 people, exhausted, bleeding, barely standing, and his expression softened. "You runaways?" Moses nodded. "From Georgia?" Another nod. The man smiled, and it was a real smile, full of warmth and understanding. "Welcome to Tennessee. Name's Josiah Freeman, and you're safe now." Josiah Freeman and his companions, 2 younger men named Marcus and David, both born free in Tennessee, led the runaways to a settlement called New Hope. It wasn't on any map. It wasn't supposed to be. It was a collection of homesteads carved out of the wilderness, maybe 40 families, all black, all free or freed, all living on land they'd claimed or bought or simply refused to leave. It was the most beautiful thing Moses had ever seen. They arrived at sunset, and people came out of their cabins to greet them. Women with kind faces, children running and laughing, men who shook their hands like equals. Big Ruth started crying and couldn't stop. Esther collapsed into someone's arms and was carried to a bed. Tobias and Jacob held each other and wept. Samuel just stood there, staring like he'd walked into heaven by mistake. Moses felt something break inside him, a wall he'd built to survive, crumbling now because he didn't need it anymore. They fed them real food, hot food, cornbread and beans and pork, and gave them clean clothes. They tended to their wounds, wrapped their feet, gave them medicine for the fever that Samuel had been fighting for 2 days. They asked no questions that first night, just welcomed them like family. The next morning, Moses woke in a real bed for the first time in his life. He lay there for a long time, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the sounds of a settlement waking up. Birds singing, a rooster crowing, children laughing, someone chopping wood. Normal sounds, free sounds. He got up and walked outside. Josiah was sitting on the porch, smoking a pipe, watching the sun come up over the mountains. He nodded at Moses, gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Sleep well?" Josiah asked. "Best I ever slept." They sat in silence for a while, 2 men who understood each other without needing words. Finally, Josiah spoke. "You planning to stay or keep moving north?" Moses thought about it. Thought about the Underground Railroad, about Canada, about the stories of places where slavery didn't exist at all. But he also thought about little James, about Esther's baby, about Big Ruth, who'd walked every step beside him without complaint. They were tired. They'd earned rest. "Stay," Moses said, "if you'll have us." Josiah smiled. "Got 50 acres just east of here, good soil, needs clearing. You work it, it's yours. All I ask is you help the next ones who come through." Moses looked at him. "The next ones?" "There's always next ones," Josiah said. "Long as there's slavery, there'll be people running from it. And long as there's people running, we'll be here to catch 'em." Moses felt something settle in his chest. Something solid and true. "Then we'll stay." They built a cabin that fall. Moses, Samuel, Elijah, Tobias and Jacob, with help from the other men in the settlement. Big Ruth and Esther planted a garden, using the seeds the Cherokee had given them. Corn, beans, squash. The 3 sisters, someone called them, sacred plants that grew together, supported each other, thrived in the right soil. Little James spent his days wandering the edges of the settlement, talking to his invisible companions, occasionally bringing back useful information. Where to find wild ginseng, where a storm was coming from, which creek had the best fishing. People learned not to doubt him. In November, Esther gave birth to a daughter. She named her Freedom. Moses held the baby one morning, this tiny life born into a world where she would never know chains, never know auction blocks, never know the weight of someone else's ownership. And he cried, because his mother had held him the same way once, and she'd known he would know all those things, and she'd loved him anyway. "You did good," Big Ruth said, standing beside him. "Got us all here." "We got each other here," Moses corrected. Winter came, hard and cold, but the settlement endured. They had food, they had shelter, they had each other. And on clear nights, when Moses stood outside and looked south toward Georgia, he thought about the Cherokee warriors who'd saved their lives. He wondered if they were still out there, still fighting, still refusing to disappear. He hoped they were, because the land remembered. The land always remembered. And some debts could only be paid in blood. Word of new hope spread slowly, carefully through networks that didn't officially exist. The Underground Railroad wasn't a railroad at all, wasn't even underground most of the time. It was a collection of brave people, black and white and indigenous, who believed that some things were worth dying for. Freedom was one of them. By the spring of 1837, New Hope had grown to 60 families. Some came from Georgia, some from Alabama, some from as far south as Mississippi. They all had stories. Stories of midnight escapes, of rivers crossed, of dogs eluded, of patrollers killed or escaped, and they all carried scars, inside and out. Moses became one of the settlement's leaders, though he never asked for the role. People just naturally looked to him when decisions needed to be made. He'd proven himself on the trail, proven he could think clearly when death was breathing down his neck, proven he'd put the group before himself. Samuel became the settlement scout, ranging south into Georgia to watch the roads, to count patrols, to bring back information about who was hunting and who was running. His one eye saw more than most men's two. Elijah took to farming like he'd been born to it, which in a way he had, just never for himself. The land responded to his hands. Things grew. Tobias and Jacob, the brothers, built furniture, chairs, tables, bed frames, and traded them with white settlements nearby. It was dangerous work interacting with whites, but the boys were smart and careful and always traveled with others. Big Ruth became a midwife, helping birth the settlement's children, tending to the sick. Her hands, scarred from cotton and tobacco and endless labor, were gentle when they needed to be. Esther raised freedom and planted gardens and sang songs her own mother had taught her, songs that came from across an ocean, from a place she'd never see, but still carried in her blood. And little James grew. He was 7 now, still quiet, still strange, still seeing things others couldn't. But he was alive, and he was free, and that was enough. In June, Samuel came back from a scouting run with troubling news. "There's talk," he said, gathered with Moses, Josiah, and a few other settlement leaders in Josiah's cabin. "Down in Dalton, in Dalo-Niga. They're organizing something. Militia, maybe more. Word is some planter, Calhoun, I think, has been pushing the governor to do something about Indian insurgents and runaway colonies." Moses felt his stomach tighten. "They know about us. They know something's up here. Don't think they know exactly where, but they're looking. And Samuel..." Josiah leaned forward. "What else?" Samuel hesitated. "There's bounties, not just for runaways anymore, for anyone helping them. White, black, don't matter. They're calling it harboring fugitive property. $500 for information leading to a settlement." The room went quiet. $500 was enough to make poor men rich, enough to make desperate men dangerous, enough to turn neighbor against neighbor. "How long we got?" Moses asked. "Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be months, could be they never find us." Samuel paused. "But I wouldn't bet on it." Josiah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the settlement, at families working their land, children playing, smoke rising from cook fires. 60 families, nearly 200 souls, all of them guilty of the crime of wanting to be human. "We fought for this," Josiah said quietly. "We bled for this. I ain't giving it up without a fight." "Fight how?" one of the other men asked. "We got maybe 20 guns in the whole settlement, most of them old hunting rifles. They come with militia, with numbers." "Then we don't fight them head on," Moses interrupted. "We do what worked before, what the Cherokee taught us." Everyone looked at him. "We make it cost," Moses continued. "We make this place dangerous to find. We set watchers on every approach. We dig pits, set traps, make the forest itself an enemy. And if they do come—" He met each man's eyes. "We make sure some of them don't leave." "You're talking about killing white men," another settler said, his voice low. "You know what that brings down on us, on our families." "I know what not fighting brings," Moses said. "I know what surrender brings. I wore those scars for 18 years. He stood. "I ain't wearing them again, and I ain't letting my people wear them either." The room was silent for a long moment. Then Josiah nodded. "We prepare for war, and we pray it never comes." They spent the next 3 weeks transforming New Hope into something that could defend itself. The men dug concealed pits along the main approaches, covered them with branches and leaves. They fashioned spikes from sharpened wood and placed them in the undergrowth. They built elevated positions in the trees, snipers' nests, Samuel called them, though most had never heard the term. The women organized evacuation plans, where the children would go if fighting started, which families would grab what supplies, which routes through the mountains were safest. They cached food in hidden locations, buried valuables, prepared for the possibility that they might have to abandon everything and run. And they trained. Moses had never been a soldier, but he'd seen violence, understood it in his bones. He taught the men how to move quietly, how to use terrain, how to make themselves difficult targets. Samuel taught tracking and counter-tracking. Josiah, who'd spent time with Seminole warriors in Florida before coming north, taught guerrilla tactics. Hit and fade, strike and vanish, make the enemy afraid of every shadow. But the children, they tried to keep the children innocent as long as possible. Little James found Moses one evening at the edge of the settlement, watching the sun set over the mountains. The boy sat beside him without speaking, just present in that way he had. "You see something?" Moses asked after a while. "Lots of things." "Anything I should know about?" Little James was quiet for a moment. "The woman with the feathers says blood is coming, says the land will drink deep before this is over." Moses felt cold despite the warm evening. "The Cherokee woman, the one you talked about before. She ain't Cherokee, she's older. Older than the Cherokee, older than anybody. She says she's been here since the beginning, watching people come and go, watching them fight over her, bleed on her, die for her." Little James looked up at Moses with those two old eyes. "She says the land don't take sides. It just remembers." Moses put his arm around the boy's thin shoulders. "You scared?" "No," Little James said simply. "Can't be scared of what's already decided. Nothing's decided. We got choices." "Some choices," the boy agreed. "But some things just are. Like the river. You can choose which way you swim, but the river's still gonna flow." Moses wanted to argue, wanted to tell the boy he was wrong, that free will meant something, that they'd escaped slavery precisely because they'd chosen to. But looking at little James's face, ancient and young at the same time, he wasn't sure the boy was wrong. "Well," Moses said finally, "we chose to be free, and we'll choose to stay that way, however we have to." Little James nodded. "She knows. That's why she's watching." The attack came on a Tuesday in July, early morning, when the mist still hung low in the valleys. Samuel was on watch in one of the tree positions when he saw them. Maybe 30 men, possibly more, moving through the forest from the south. They had guns, horses tied up a mile back, and the grim determination of men who'd been promised money and righteousness in equal measure. Samuel didn't sound an alarm, not yet. He watched them come, counted them, assessed their weapons and formation. Then he climbed down silently and ran for the settlement. "They're here," he said, bursting into Josiah's cabin where the leaders had gathered for morning planning. 30 men, maybe more, armed, coming from the south trail. Moses felt his blood go cold and hot at the same time. "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe less. The settlement transformed in seconds from a peaceful community into something else entirely. Women grabbed children, men grabbed weapons. Everyone moved to their assigned positions with a speed that came from practice and fear. Moses found himself at the southern defensive position with Samuel, Elijah, and 6 other men. They had 4 rifles, 2 shotguns, and a collection of improvised weapons, axes, hammers, sharpened stakes. Against 30 armed white men, it wouldn't be enough, but it would have to be. "Remember," Moses said quietly, "we don't start shooting until they're past the first pit. Let the forest do some of our work." The men nodded, their faces tight with tension. They waited. The mist began to burn off as the sun rose higher. Birds sang, ignorant of what was coming. A breeze moved through the trees, carrying the smell of pine and earth and something else. Something metallic and old. Blood, maybe, or the memory of it. Then they heard them. Boots crashing through undergrowth. Voices, white voices, talking too loud, too confident. These weren't professional soldiers. These were militia, vigilantes, men who'd answered the call for bounty money and the chance to put troublesome Negroes back in their place. They had no idea what they were walking into. The first man hit the concealed pit and went down with a scream that cut through the morning like a knife. The sharpened stakes at the bottom found soft tissue, and his cry was one of shock and agony and disbelief. The militia stopped, confused, trying to understand what had happened. 2 more men rushed forward to help, and both went down, one into another pit, one onto sharpened stakes hidden in the brush. His screams joined the first man's in a horrible harmony. "It's a trap!" someone yelled. "Fall back!" But Moses had already given the signal. The rifles cracked from the tree positions. Samuel's shot took a man through the chest. Elijah hit another in the leg. The other shooters found targets or came close enough to send the militia scrambling for cover. "Where are they?" a militia member shouted. "Where are the shots coming from?" They couldn't see the shooters. The defensive positions were too well hidden, too well camouflaged. They were being killed by an invisible enemy. And nothing terrifies men more than that. A larger man, probably the leader, Moses thought, tried to rally them. "Form up! Return fire! They're just—" Samuel's second shot caught him in the throat. He went down gurgling, and the militia's fragile courage broke completely. They ran. Not in formation, not in any organized retreat, just pure panic, men scrambling over each other to get away from this forest that had turned hostile, from this enemy they couldn't see or understand. Some grabbed their wounded, some abandoned them. 2 more fell into pits in their haste to escape. Moses watched them go, his heart hammering, adrenaline singing in his veins. They'd done it. They'd turned back 30 armed men with minimal casualties. But as the last of the militia disappeared into the forest, Moses felt no triumph, only dread, because he knew what came next. The militia staggered back to Dahlonega by noon, carrying 4 dead and 7 wounded. The survivors told wild stories of hundreds of armed Negroes, of Indians fighting alongside them, of the forest itself attacking them. The stories grew with each telling, the way scared men's stories always do. Sheriff Wardlaw listened with a sinking heart. He'd known this was coming, had known from the moment he buried the story of the scalped patrollers that it was only buying time. But he'd hoped, he'd hoped that time would be enough for tempers to cool, for people to forget, for the problem to solve itself. Instead, it had gotten worse. Edmund Calhoun was in his office within the hour, redder-faced than ever, practically foaming at the mouth. "I told you!" he shouted. "I told you this would happen. They're organizing, they're armed, they're killing white men." 4 dead, Wardlaw said quietly. "And they never would have died if you hadn't sent them up there. You defending them?" Calhoun's voice went dangerously soft. "You defending slaves, Ben. I'm saying maybe we pushed when we should have let it lie. Those people aren't bothering anyone. They're just trying to live. Their property," Calhoun spat. "My property, and the property of every other planter from here to Mobile. You let them live free, you let them build their little settlements. You're telling every slave in the South that they can just walk away. You're inviting rebellion. Wardlaw stood. He was tired, so tired of this, of the violence, of the endless grinding machine that turned human beings into property and anyone who questioned it into a traitor. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Calhoun smiled, and it was a terrible smile. "I want you to write to the governor. Tell him we need military support. Tell him we have an insurgency. Tell him whatever you need to tell him, but get us soldiers." He leaned forward. "And then we're going to burn that settlement to the ground and hang every last one of them as a lesson." Wardlaw looked at Calhoun for a long moment. Then he sat down and began to write. The letter reached Governor William Schley in Milledgeville 3 days later. Schley was a practical man, a politician who understood that his job was to maintain order and protect property in that order. Reports of armed slaves and possible Cherokee insurgents were exactly the kind of thing that could end a political career if not handled decisively. He authorized 2 companies of Georgia militia, 60 men, to march north under the command of Colonel Marcus Blackwood, a veteran of the Creek Wars who knew how to fight Indians and wasn't squeamish about killing them. The orders were simple: locate the settlement, arrest any fugitive slaves, disperse any illegal squatters, and use whatever force was necessary to restore order. Colonel Blackwood read the orders and smiled. This would be easy. He had no idea how wrong he was. The Georgia militia marched north on a Monday in late July, 60 men strong, armed with rifles, pistols, and the absolute confidence of men who'd never lost a war against people they didn't consider fully human. Colonel Marcus Blackwood rode at the front, a career military man with grey in his beard and scars from campaigns against Creek and Seminole tribes. He'd burned villages before, driven out insurgents, hanged troublemakers. This would be just another campaign, another line in his service record. He was wrong about that. Samuel spotted them 2 days before they reached New Hope, a column of soldiers moving with military precision, not the scattered rabble of the militia. He rode back to the settlement faster than he'd ever ridden, his horse lathered with sweat, his one good eye wild. "Army," he gasped, sliding from his horse in front of Josiah's cabin. 60 men, maybe more, soldiers, real ones, 2 days out, maybe less. Moses felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. They'd prepared for militia, for bounty hunters, for small groups of raiders. But 60 trained soldiers? "We can't win this," one of the men said, his voice hollow. "Not against those numbers." The settlement leaders gathered in Josiah's cabin: Moses, Samuel, Elijah, Big Ruth, Josiah, and a dozen others. The mood was grim, the air thick with fear and anger, and the terrible weight of impossible choices. "We run," someone suggested. "Pack up, scatter into the mountains, meet up later." "There is no later," Josiah interrupted. "We run, we're running forever. We give this up. We got nothing. Nowhere to build, nowhere to plant, nowhere to be. We stay, we die," Big Ruth said flatly. "All of us, including the children." The room went silent. Moses stood and walked to the window, looking out at the settlement they'd built with their own hands, with blood and hope and defiance. 60 families, children who'd never known chains, gardens growing from Cherokee seeds, freedom, real and solid and theirs. And then he thought about little James's words. "The woman with the feathers says blood is coming, says the land will drink deep before this is over." He turned back to the room. "We send the children away," Moses said. "The women who want to go, they go too. Take what you can carry and head north into the mountains. There's Cherokee up there still, hidden communities. They'll take you in." "And the rest of us?" Samuel asked, though his expression said he already knew. "The rest of us stay," Moses said. "We make this cost so much that they think twice about hunting free black people ever again. We make them bleed for every inch of this land. And if we die—" He paused, meeting each person's eyes. "We die free." Big Ruth stood. "I'm staying." "Ruth," Moses started. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice steel. "I walked every step to get here, ain't running now. If this is where it ends, then this is where I stand." Others stood. Samuel, Elijah, Josiah, Tobias, and Jacob, the brothers who were barely men but had men's courage. One by one, nearly 30 people made their choice to stay, to fight, to draw a line in the blood-soaked earth and say no further. Esther gathered little James and baby Freedom, tears streaming down her face. "You come back," she told Moses, even though she knew it was a lie. "You hear me? You come back." Moses held her, held both children, memorized the weight of them. "You tell Freedom about us," he said. "Tell her what we did here. Tell her we didn't bow." They evacuated 40 women and children that night, sending them north with guides who knew the mountain trails. The children cried, confused about why they were leaving. The mothers cried, knowing why. Little James looked back once as they disappeared into the darkness, his old young eyes meeting Moses's, and he nodded, an acknowledgement, a goodbye, a blessing. Then they were gone, swallowed by the forest, and the 30 who remained prepared for war. They fortified what they could, built barricades from wagons and logs, positioned shooters in the best defensive locations, stockpiled ammunition, sharpened weapons. Josiah distributed the firearms. They had 18 rifles, 4 shotguns, and a collection of old pistols that might or might not work. Against 60 trained soldiers with military weapons, it was laughably inadequate. But they had other advantages. They knew this land, every tree, every creek, every ridge. They'd walked it, worked it, claimed it in ways the militia never could, and they had nothing to lose. The most dangerous fighters are the ones who've already accepted death. Moses spent the last night before the attack walking the perimeter of the settlement, checking positions, offering quiet words to the men and women who'd chosen to stay. Big Ruth was cleaning her rifle with the same steady hands she'd used to birth babies. Samuel was sharpening stakes, his face calm. Elijah was praying, his lips moving silently. Tobias and Jacob sat together, the way they always had, drawing strength from each other. "You scared?" Tobias asked his younger brother. "Terrified," Jacob admitted. "You?" "Yeah." They sat in silence for a moment. "But I'd rather be scared and free than safe and a slave," Tobias said finally. Jacob nodded. "Me too." As dawn approached, Moses found himself standing where little James had stood weeks before, looking south toward Georgia, toward the life he'd escaped and the death that was now coming for him. He thought about his mother, sold away when he was 8, about the woman who'd whispered, "When the door opens, you walk through it." He'd walked through that door. He'd lived free, even if only for a year. He'd stood upright, looked white men in the eye, built something with his own hands. If he died today, he died human. That was worth everything. The sun rose red and angry, bleeding across the sky like an omen, and the soldiers came. Colonel Blackwood approached with military precision, scouts first, then skirmish lines, then the main body of troops. He'd expected resistance, but was surprised by the sophistication of the defenses. These weren't ignorant field hands. Someone here understood tactics. He ordered his men to halt just outside rifle range and surveyed the settlement through his spyglass. He could see barricades, defensive positions, and, his eyebrows rose, what looked like concealed pits and traps along the approaches. "They've dug in," he said to his lieutenant. "Whoever's leading them knows what they're doing." "Just slaves, sir," the lieutenant said dismissively. "We'll overrun them in minutes." Blackwood lowered his spyglass and gave the young officer a hard look. "People who've got nothing to lose fight twice as hard as people who do. Don't underestimate them." He raised his voice, addressing the settlement. "You in there. This is Colonel Marcus Blackwood of the Georgia militia. You're occupying land illegally and harboring fugitive slaves. Surrender now, and you'll be treated fairly under the law." From behind the barricades, Josiah's voice rang out strong and clear. This is our land. We worked it, we built on it, we're living free on it. And we ain't slaves anymore. We're people. You want us, you come and take us." A cheer went up from the defenders, fierce and defiant. Blackwood shook his head. He'd given them a chance. What came next was on them. "Artillery!" he ordered. "Burn them out!" The two small cannons they'd brought were wheeled forward and loaded with grapeshot. Blackwood wasn't interested in taking prisoners. Governor Schlei's orders had been clear enough beneath the official language. Restore order. Make an example. The cannons fired with a roar that shook the earth. Grapeshot tore through the barricades, through the cabins, through flesh and bone and hope. The defenders returned fire, rifles cracking, but against cannons and 60 trained soldiers, it was like spitting into a hurricane. The battle lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of smoke and screaming, of blood turning Georgia clay to mud, of brave people dying for the simple right to be human. Moses fought like a demon, firing until his rifle was empty, then grabbing a spear, then an axe, never stopping, never surrendering. Samuel took a bullet to the chest and kept fighting, propped against a barricade, firing with his one good eye until he couldn't hold the rifle anymore. Big Ruth killed 3 soldiers before a cannonball took half the cabin she was defending. She died instantly, her face peaceful in death, finally free from the pain she'd carried for so long. Elijah fought hand to hand with a soldier twice his size and won, only to be shot in the back by another. He died reaching for the seeds the Cherokee had given them, trying to protect them even as his blood watered the earth. Tobias and Jacob died together, the way they'd lived, holding each other as the bullets found them. One by one, the defenders fell, but they made it cost. 15 soldiers dead, 23 wounded. Colonel Blackwood himself took a spear to the shoulder that would never quite heal right. And every man who survived would carry nightmares of the battle, of facing an enemy who refused to break, who fought with desperate courage, who died free rather than live enslaved. By noon, it was over. Moses found himself the last one standing, bleeding from a dozen wounds, surrounded by bodies of friends and enemies alike. His rifle was empty, his weapons gone, his strength finally failing. Colonel Blackwood approached on foot, his own rifle trained on Moses's chest. The two men stared at each other across 10 feet of blood-soaked ground, one a soldier of the state, one a man who'd refused to be property. "You could have surrendered," Blackwood said, and there was something like respect in his voice. "Could have lived," Moses smiled, blood on his teeth. "No," he said. "I couldn't. Not as a slave. Never again as a slave. You killed 15 of my men, and I'd kill 15 more to stay free." Blackwood raised his rifle. "Any last words?" Moses thought about Esther and little James and baby Freedom, safe in the mountains. Thought about the seeds that would grow somewhere else, in free soil, tended by free hands. Thought about his mother whispering, "When the door opens, you walk through it." "Tell them," Moses said, his voice strong despite everything. "Tell every slave from here to the ocean. Tell them we were here. Tell them we fought. Tell them we died free." He met Blackwood's eyes. "And tell them it was worth it." Blackwood hesitated for just a moment. Then he pulled the trigger. Moses fell, and the land drank deep, just like little James had said it would. The militia burned what was left of New Hope to the ground. They buried their own dead and left the black bodies where they fell, as a lesson. Colonel Blackwood filed his report. Settlement destroyed, insurgents eliminated, order restored. Governor Schley commended him for his service. The newspapers ran brief stories about a minor engagement with hostile elements in North Georgia. Most mentioned Indians, not black people. Some mentioned neither. Within weeks, it disappeared from public record entirely. But the story didn't die. Stories like that never die. Esther and the survivors, 40 women and children who'd escaped into the mountains, found shelter with a hidden Cherokee community led by Tsali, the warrior who'd saved Moses' life a year before. When he heard what had happened, Tsali wept, for Moses, for the others, for all the blood this stolen land had drunk. "They were warriors," he told Esther. "They died as warriors. The land will remember them. The survivors stayed with the Cherokee for a year, then slowly made their way further north, to Tennessee, to Kentucky, to Ohio, following the Underground Railroad all the way to Canada. Esther carried the seeds Moses had protected and planted them in free soil in Ontario. The three sisters grew strong there, thrived there, fed free people in free land. Little James grew up to be a preacher, and he told the story of new hope in black churches across the north, kept the memory alive when others wanted it forgotten. Freedom, his sister, had children of her own, and she taught them what their mother had taught her, that their people had fought, had bled, had refused to bow, and in the mountains of North Georgia, the Cherokee remembered too. Charlie and his warriors continued their resistance for another year, before the army finally caught them. Charlie was executed, but before he died, he told his captors about the settlement, about the black men and women who'd fought beside no one but stood for the same thing, the right to exist on their own terms. "The land knows blood," he said, "all blood, yours and mine and theirs, and it remembers." Epilogue. The site of New Hope was abandoned, reclaimed by the forest over the decades. The cabins rotted, the fields grew wild, the graves disappeared beneath layers of leaves and time. But locals knew the place, avoided it, told stories about it when they thought no one official was listening. They said that on certain nights, when the wind moved through the pines just right, you could hear voices, black voices and indigenous voices, singing together in languages that sounded like sorrow and defiance and hope, all mixed together. They said the ground there was different, richer somehow, like it had been fed by something more than rain and sun. They said that escaped slaves still sometimes found their way there, drawn by stories or dreams or something deeper, and when they did, they felt welcomed, protected, blessed by blood that had been freely given for freedom. And they said, though this part was whispered, never spoken aloud, that sometimes on stormy nights you could see them, 30 figures standing in the ruins of the settlement, weapons in hand, facing south toward Georgia, still refusing to bow, still guarding the land they died to keep free. The historians never recorded any of this, of course. The official record said nothing about New Hope, nothing about Moses or Big Ruth or Samuel or any of them. In the eyes of the law, they'd never existed as people, just as property that had gone missing and been recovered one way or another. But history isn't just what's written down. History is what's remembered, what's passed down through stories and songs, and the bone-deep knowledge that gets handed from generation to generation. The Cherokee remembered. The escaped slaves who made it north remembered. Their children remembered, and their children's children remembered. They remembered that in 1836 and 1837, in the mountains of North Georgia, a group of escaped slaves and a band of Cherokee warriors had drawn a line in the blood-soaked earth and said no further. They'd fought for freedom when freedom was illegal, died for dignity when dignity was denied, refused to be less than human when the whole weight of law and custom said they were. They'd lost the battle, but won something more important, proof that resistance was possible, that the oppressed could strike back, that the machine of slavery could be defied. And that proof spread like wildfire through the Underground Railroad, whispered in slave quarters from Georgia to Virginia, sung in coded spirituals that promised a promised land, but also promised that the journey there would be watered with blood. And that was okay, that was right, that freedom had always been worth dying for. The Civil War came 24 years later, and when black men finally got guns and uniforms and the chance to fight officially for their freedom, they fought with a fury that shocked even their white allies. They fought remembering New Hope and 100 places like it, places where their ancestors had said enough and meant it. And when the war was over and Reconstruction began, when black people started building communities and schools and churches and farms on land they actually owned, they remembered Moses and Big Ruth and Esther and all the others who'd planted seeds in blood-soaked soil and made something grow. The land remembered too. Even now, more than 150 years later, if you know where to look in the North Georgia mountains, if you have a guide who knows the old trails, who listens to the stories, who respects what happened there, you can find it, the site where New Hope once stood. There's nothing official marking it, no historical plaque, no monument, no recognition from the state, just forest, deep and old and quiet. But the trees there grow different, taller, stronger, like they're drawing nourishment from something powerful buried in the earth. And the Cherokee descendants who still live in those mountains say the place is sacred, say it should be left alone, say that some ground is too holy for tourists and too heavy with memory for casual visitors. They say that on August 14th every year, the anniversary of the escape from Hollow Creek Plantation, if you stand in that clearing at dawn, you can feel them. Moses and Big Ruth and Samuel and Elijah and all the others. Still there, still free, still refusing to be erased. And maybe that's the real victory. Not that they won, they didn't. Not that they survived, most didn't. But that they lived free for a year, fought free for a day, and died free when they could have died enslaved. They chose freedom over survival, dignity over safety, resistance over submission, and in doing so, they became something more than escaped slaves, or insurgents, or victims. They became legends. They became proof. They became the answer to every person who's ever wondered if resistance is possible, if fighting back is worth it, if one small group of people can make a difference against overwhelming power. The answer is yes. It always has been. The land remembers. The stories remember. And as long as there are people who need to hear that resistance is possible, that freedom is worth fighting for, that dignity is worth dying for, the story of Moses and New Hope and the Cherokee warriors who stood with them will live on. Because some stories are too true to die, some blood is too precious to forget, and some freedom is too hard-won to ever take for granted. The wind still moves through the pines of North Georgia, carrying two languages, one crying for freedom, the other for justice, long denied. And if you listen closely, you can hear them both saying the same thing. We were here. We mattered. We fought. We were free, and no power on earth, no matter how great, can ever take that away.